Hello, my name is Anna Burckhardt Pérez. I am the curator of Threads to the South at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art. The exhibition investigates our own relationship to the territory and to notions of belonging through the lens of textiles and fiber in the context of displacement, fractured identities, and longing for home. This exhibition is made up of works that are part of ISLAA's collection, with 7 of them being recent acquisitions. I wanted to localize the discourse around fiber and thread in the very particular identities and traditions that exist within Latin America. And so you'll notice that a lot of the works in the exhibition are not just made with thread, but in a lot of the cases they use it as a conceptual medium. When textiles are made with organic material, they establish a very direct connection between their makers and the territory from which they belong. At the same time, when textiles are made with synthetic fiber, they can be reminders of the perils of a globalized economy and some of the dangers that the textile industry can pose onto the planet. Textiles can be both our sort of first mediator between ourselves and the outside world, but they can also be a barrier between ourselves and the outside world. So I thought it would be really interesting to highlight these contradictions or these sort of like contradictory layers of meaning in a show that deals with artists that are working within Latin America, which is a region that is, of course, still grappling with legacies of colonialism, displacement, and imperialism. The exhibition begins with Vaso de Leche Bogotá, which is the documentation of a performance organized by Cecilia Vicuña in 1979 when she was living in Bogotá, Colombia, following the coup that led to the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Cecilia wanted to respond to a call to action issued by a Chilean group called CAA, which stands for Colectivo Acciones de Arte, but she wanted to sort of root it also in her local context. And so she chose to draw attention to a sort of controversy that had happened recently in Colombia where 2,000 children had died by drinking contaminated milk that had been disseminated by a private company. And so in her performance, as you can see here, Cecilia spills a glass of milk by tugging on a red thread. She also writes a poem in chalk on the street. In the poem, and also in the performance as a whole, Cecilia equates milk with blood, and in doing so, she also sort of creates a connection with the red thread that she's pulling. And you will see across a lot of the works in the show where the red thread can represent blood from very different, sort of almost contradictory, but also complementary perspectives. In the case of Antonio Pichillá, which you can see right here, he is looking at red particularly within the context of his own Maya Tujuli heritage. This work, which is called Nudo, and it's part of a larger series of work called Nudo or Bats, investigates the knot as a symbolic element in Maya cosmovision, in which it represents that what ties beings, not just human beings, but beings in general, to their beginnings. In this case, he says the knot is also what allows for the sort of very contradictory systems of meaning to tie into each other for a whole universe to be able to exist. And he's also referencing other sort of sacred aspects of Maya cosmology, particularly the color red, as you can see here, speaks not only to blood, but it also speaks to a very particular type of corn that is of a red color that grows in Guatemala. Corn is sacred for Maya communities. And so by highlighting this aspect, he's not only sort of honoring his own Maya heritage, he's also resisting the sort of globalized systems that make availability to corn particularly difficult for local communities in Guatemala and other parts of Latin America. One thing that the show tries to do is question established systems. And in one way that it does is that it highlights a lot of works that are looking at textiles as an inherited practice, a practice that is taught from generation to generation. In doing that, the artists in the show are questioning sort of lineal ideas of time, and instead they're sort of creating or arguing for a more circular idea of time in which the past continues to inform the present, and together they form new futures. It was also important to highlight the lineages of fiber artists that have been working throughout Latin America for many, many decades. The work of Nora Correas is a particular example of these lineages of sort of artists that have been dealing with craft in very particular ways, but her work is also very localized to the Argentinian context. She began working with thread out of accessibility more than anything. She was an artist who was also a mother and spent a lot of time at home. And so working with fiber was particularly useful for her. But as Argentina's military dictatorship began in 1976, fiber also became a way for her to explore the very real ways in which anger and pain manifests themselves in the body. So if you look at this work, which is called En Carne Viva, or In the Raw, and it is made of woven end pieces that are also stacked together. So if you look at it closely, you can kind of see that the work is almost sort of barely standing. It seems like any sort of movement might dismember its parts. And it also evokes ideas of cliffs and sort of particular cavernous landscapes, as well as human flesh and insides. And so Correa was particularly interested in sort of highlighting the way in which the body, as a territory itself, can be affected by feelings of anger or feelings of pain and sadness, and also of grief. She has said many times that she's aware that, art itself cannot really change the situation in which Argentinians were finding themselves in at the time, but that she would feel very badly if she couldn't emit a scream. And if you look at her work, particularly of this time, it of course connotes violence, but in a sort of very visceral way. The artists in this exhibition also explore the ways in which fiber, a very malleable material that can also be transported very easily, can be used to remove art from the walls of the museum or the gallery and explore what happens when it joins the real world. Such is the case with this work by Hélio Oiticica, a Brazilian artist who was born in 1937. In this work, Oiticica pays tribute to his friend Manuel Moreira, better known as Cara de Cavallo, who was murdered by a Rio de Janeiro paramilitary organization after he had been accused of killing a police officer. The work is a flag that features a screen-printed image of Moreira, which heavily circulated in newspapers in Brazil at the time, and it showcases his body lying dead on the floor with the words, "Be marginal, be a hero." The flag was actually appropriated and embraced by many as a symbol of what marginality can do to resist established systems of power and to create new, more open-minded societies. The title of the show, Threats to the South, is based or inspired by a poem by Chilean artist and poet Cecilia Vicuña, in which she writes, "I am climbing the threats that lie over there in the South." I was inspired by this particular line because it not only speaks to longing, of course. She's an artist that has lived most of her life in the global North and speaks often about sort of reclaiming those roots that connect her to Chile. But it also speaks to a very active longing, which means that she's climbing up towards her native Andes mountains, and therefore she's sort of resisting what keeps her displaced. And so you will see in a lot of the works in this show that even though they are reacting to that which fractures their identities, whether it be displacement or something else, they are also actively resisting these forces through the very sacred traditions of making, through textiles or through other craft practices. This show features a sort of wide range of fiber-based practices, as I mentioned before, again, from the sort of very simple yarn to blankets that are synthetic and have been purchased, but also, of course, very particular craft and textile traditions or traditions of making that inform the sort of very complex histories of belonging and identity that exist in Latin America. There are some works that are weaving-based that employ both a backstrap loom as well as a floor-based loom, which of course speak to the sort of like merging of textile cultures that came from colonization. There are works that engage with crochet, which is also a European tradition, but that has been sort of passed down through generations of makers and knitters and weavers in various regions of Latin America. And in sort of highlighting this sort of mixture of influences and mixture of techniques, the show also speaks about the sort of very fractured and very fraught idea of identity, how all of our identities, not just as Latin Americans, not just within particular countries or regions, come from the mixture of a lot of different influences. And a lot of the artists here are sort of exploring what that means in the context of displacement or in the context of longing for their own home. How does one construct an identity when one has a lot of very sort of different threads of inspiration that make us who we are?